Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Tim Gray. I'm Executive Director of Environmental Defense, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of our new recovery series of webinars, and subtitled Turning Crises into Solutions. Joining me today is Fatima Crerar, who's the Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at the Atmospheric Fund. She's also a longtime Environmental Defense board member. Hey, Fatima.
Hi, Tim. Hi, Tim. Hi, everyone.
For those of you who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do, but Environmental Defense is Canada's leading Canadian advocacy organization. And we work with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. Our work includes things like campaigning to get toxic BPA out of receipt paper, advocating for greater protection of the Great Lakes, and working to end subsidies in the oil and gas companies. So we're going to get going with our first slide, and we're going to be digging into how, in these really unprecedented times, Canada can chart a path towards long-term resilience and recovery for a sustainable decade ahead. Before we get started in diving into all the content, I wanted to make sure that we explained a little bit about the webinar software and how it's going to work today. We've had about 1,000 people register for the webinar, and we're going to be taking questions through its Q&A function. You can see at the bottom of your screen, there's a control panel with a Q&A icon. And if you click on that and type, our team is monitoring your questions, and Fatima and I will be responding to some of them towards the end of the webinar. We're also going to be posting this on YouTube, and if you'd like to share it with a friend or family members, we'll be sharing those links so you can do that later on. So as I mentioned, these are really unprecedented times, and that's where we're launching this series to provide an environmental perspective on the crisis. We're all challenged and stressed by what's going on. And but in this time, we've also seen some amazing acts of selflessness by nurses, doctors, and people working to keep food available for us all. That's just to name a few. We've also seen our federal and provincial governments respond appropriately and well to protect Canadians from sickness and economic hardship. So despite the existing challenges, and still more to come, we're sure, we've seen that Canadians can come together to tackle big challenges and work to ensure that the lives and well-being of us all are made a priority. We also know that we as a society will emerge from this health crisis with choices to make how we should invest to help with economic recovery. Some will push for massive injection of public money, our money, into industries that science tells us need to get smaller, not bigger, like oil, coal, gas, and plastics. They will and are demanding repeal and rollback of laws and rules that are meant to prevent pollution, address climate change, and ensure future sustainability. We have examples in the US and Canada where this is already underway. But we believe that such an approach would be a huge mistake, with catastrophic consequences that would waste our last best chance to move our society in a direction that invests in people. I think you would agree with me that our governments have done a good job so far in addressing this crisis, and we want to help lead a conversation on what great can look like, and we can help our leaders to make the right decisions as we emerge from this incredible health crisis. For us at Environmental Defense, we have been working through our programs to identify areas that would be the basis for recovery. And that's the basis on which we've built this webinar series. So today we're going to introduce the topics we intend to explore over the coming weeks, and also dive deeper into some of the solutions that are out there, ready to be implemented, that can bring back jobs, investments, and prosperity. In the coming several weeks, we will explore climate solutions, reducing single-use plastics, threats and opportunities around our work in the Great Lakes, green chemistry and safe cleaning practices, a deeper dive into the issues related to industry attempts to use this crisis to roll back protections for the environment, and end on a hopeful look about how Canada could shape our future by investing in all of these areas for a more just and sustainable future. So now back to something specific and practical to talk about today. I wanted to provide that overview of where we're going, but I also think that we need to get tangible very quickly. And Fatima is going to help us do that by looking very specifically at things that are, as in the parlance of economic development and recovery, shovel ready, things that we could do right away, governments could invest in that would make a huge difference. So as I mentioned, Fatima is the VP of Strategy and Partnerships at the Atmospheric Fund. And the Atmospheric Fund's role is to create a carbon neutral Greater Toronto area by 2050. And as I also mentioned, Fatima is an environmental defense board member, so she's in a great position to talk specifically about the programs that TAF is working on, but also to link that back to a lot of the policy work that environmental defense does. So we're going to look at the example of building retrofits. So that's looking at how we could actually invest in all of our housing stock. So the houses that we live in, the apartments we live in, the offices that we work in, the factories we work in, and how making them more energy efficient is something that could both be a key solution to climate change, but also be something that creates massive amounts of employment and economic opportunity for the country. So Fatima, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Tim. I want to echo your sentiments from the top of the call. I recognize that we're having a conversation right now about what we want to see and what we need to see in the coming months and years. But in fact, it's hard for many of us also just to make it through today. One of the things that's giving me a little bit of hope and optimism right now is that we know that the economic recovery agenda that's going to be needed to respond to the slowdown that we're experiencing right now is going to require government measures and investments of a scale unlike anything this generation, all of us on this call today, has ever really seen. But what gives me some hope is that if you think about it, the scale of the public sector coordination right now, this new rapid and iterative daily response and consistent level of communication, collaboration with medical professionals and scientists and specialists in supply chain and logistics, all coordinated for the public's interest and for the public's health and in the public service, that too is unlike something many of us have ever seen before. And so that really gives me a sense of what we can do when we all work together and a new sense of what's possible. The expectations are suddenly can be higher. And so that's what makes it feel so important to start talking about recovery today, to start thinking about what that shape should be. Recovery solutions, by their very nature, need to be, to a certain degree, reliable and predictable. We need to know that as we inject these dollars into the marketplace and into the economy, that we're going to see that response that we need over time, and we're going to get people back to work, and we're going to turn that economic engine back on. What I want to share with you is that there's no reason for us to undermine the climate agenda that's finally taking shape in Canada. We have reliable, predictable, road-tested solutions available to us right now, and groups like TAF and Environmental Defense and so many others across the country and across the world have been working for decades on trying out these solutions, on doing the case studies and on the evaluation. The clean tech sector in Ontario today consists of over 5,000 companies today. Almost 130,000 people work in the clean tech sector just in Ontario, and it generates revenues of almost $20 billion. So the clean green economy, it's here right now. And it's not an aspirational place we're trying to get to, it's already here. And we also have ample evidence that climate solutions are economically progressive and economically valuable because they multi-solve. They're not just climate solutions. They don't just reduce carbon, they do that, but they also increase quality and durability of our cities and resilience. They improve and protect human health and ecosystem health. They drive competitiveness, they drive innovation. So these are multi-solving solutions. And this is not pie in the sky. So I'll get to my message now on building retrofits. Building retrofits are a real example of a solution that will and can drive economic recovery, create and sustain good jobs that we need, address the climate crisis head on, and improve life for people. Homes and buildings today represent 17% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. This is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions for the country, and we can't achieve our net zero by 2050 targets without working on them. Investing in deep energy retrofits, so that's improving the energy efficiency, performance, and the carbon impacts of all of Canada's homes and buildings, is the kind of full-scale, nationwide, job-creating infrastructure agenda that will pay dividends across the board and for years to come.
So for folks who don't know the terminology, Fatima, what exactly is a deep energy retrofit? It sounds like something that's done underground.
Some of it is underground, some of it's above ground, some of it's in the walls, some of it's in the windows. We think of energy efficiency retrofit, many of us will think about draft proofing, we'll think about lighting upgrades, we'll think about plug load, we'll think about appliances. A deep energy retrofit is a multi-measure approach to energy efficiency. It's a site-specific project designed to deliver energy and non-energy related benefits. For example, when you upgrade a boiler to improve energy efficiency, you also improve thermal comfort for the residents and tenants in the building. When you clean ducts, you improve air ventilation, again increasing efficiency, but also ensuring healthy indoor air. Deep energy retrofits take a whole building view, a whole system view, and use integrated design principles and target energy and carbon improvements of at least 40%. So these are significant efficiency improvements. And as a result, deep energy retrofits are job intensive, capital intensive, localized projects, and they apply to every single city and community across the country.
So how are these retrofits, how are they going to help with the economic recovery agenda? How do we turn the costs of these into benefits?
Yeah. So 4 reasons. Deep energy retrofits can serve and will serve Canada's recovery, first of all, because they're turnkey. Right? Construction is what we're talking about here. Renovation, restoration, labor. Construction is already a multi-billion-dollar industry in Canada, supporting tens of thousands of jobs that are, and frankly, always will be by their very nature, localized, embedded in cities and communities. They're capital intensive, which is exactly what effective stimulus requires. We need channels through which significant public funds can flow and put people back to work and create economic exchange to restart the market. So if we play with some numbers here in Ontario, TAF works a great deal in multi-unit residential buildings. Multi-unit residential buildings is a technical way of describing apartment buildings, condos, towers. And in Ontario, there are about 1.6 million suites. So these are the apartment units and the condo suites inside these towers. Completing a deep energy retrofit in a suite costs on average $60,000. They can range again because they're designed to be site specific, but if we use an estimate of $60,000 to complete just one of these retrofits in one suite, that's about $102 billion in economic opportunity if we look at addressing all of Ontario's multi-unit residential buildings. If we think about completing this work between now and 2050, by which we need to be net zero, that's about $3.5 billion in economic activity every year. That is stimulus scale work. The third reason retrofits should be part of Canada's economic recovery agenda is that they require significant labor and skill to complete. Studies from Canada and the United States show that for every $1 million that's invested in building energy retrofits, we create approximately 18 job years. And if we think back to that 1.6 million suites and apartments and condos across Ontario, and we're tackling $3.5 billion of retrofit work every year, that is 63,000 job years each year. To put that into perspective, there's about 100,000 people who work in Ontario's automotive sector right now. And this is all kinds of work. This is something that gets me really excited. We've got work on site, we've got work at your desk, there's financing work, energy modeling work, labor, trades, design, engineering, project management, operations and maintenance. Significant job in terms of numbers, but also breadth in terms of reach. And that's really my last reason for being excited about the role of retrofits in Canada's economic recovery is their very scale and reach that they satisfy. Not scale in terms of capital or jobs, but in terms of reaching Canadians and Canadian families across the country. To be net zero, well, frankly, most of the buildings that are going to be here in 2050 are already here. So when we think about having net zero buildings, we're not talking about a brand new shiny building stock. We're talking about repairing and upgrading and restoring the buildings that we're in right now. And so this work is about the homes and workplaces of Canadians today. And by targeting all of Canada's homes and buildings, we can make sure that we're serving families and people and workers across the country, making homes more affordable, making buildings healthier, increasing property value, making them more resilient and more durable for the future.
Great. So you've talked to me before about this, like you guys have some very specific examples that I think that help illustrate this. And so maybe let's dive into one of those.
Yeah, sure. TAF has been working on the Towerwise Project, which is the name for our energy efficiency work in multi-unit residential buildings here in Toronto and the Greater Toronto Hamilton area for almost a decade. One project in particular I'll highlight, the photographs that were just shared were from Arletta Towers, which are a pair of towers in North York that were built in 1972. Contains 372 apartments operated by Toronto Community Housing, and it's a seniors residence. There's this really great space in the middle of a dining hall and a social hall. And between 2015 and 2018, TAF retrofitted Arletta Manor in order to improve the building's energy and water performance, to reduce carbon emissions, and with the goal of bringing down future maintenance and operating costs, which is vital for publicly funded buildings. We set targets, and working with that integrated design approach, working with teams of contractors, engineers, tradespeople, we implemented a suite of measures. So again, this was a multi-measure project. We included new boilers, heat recovery ventilators with duct cleaners, LED lighting, smart thermostats, and as a result, we delivered and achieved not only significant energy and carbon improvements, but also really tremendous quality of life improvements. And so one of the things I didn't highlight about retrofits yet that's really valuable is that you feel the benefit of them right away, right? When the work is complete, you're feeling the benefit of that energy right away. You're seeing it on your utility bills and you're breathing it in your lungs, and it pays back over the long term. At Arletta, the operational savings from a dollar perspective were $135,000 less a year for Toronto Community Housing to operate the building. The carbon emissions reductions, we improved them by 30% from the baseline every single year. And for residents, it was really significant also. And so this is about the immediate benefit to people. These buildings were really warm in the wintertime. This was due to poor air circulation and inefficient boilers. And at times, an apartment suite for a senior citizen could be as high as 26 degrees Celsius in the winter. You can't sleep when it's that hot. But through the energy efficiency upgrades that we made, we also reduced by 44% these extreme and unhealthy indoor temperatures. Almost 40% of residents reported no longer opening their windows in the winter, which is mind-blowing for energy consumption. 70% stopped using portable heaters to heat cold spots in the building. So you think about energy and you think about deep energy retrofits, but these also lend themselves to quality of life improvements every single day. And that really, Tim, takes me to my final point. Retrofitting Canada's homes and buildings was already a federal priority. Before the pandemic, this was on our government's radar, and it's part of our pan-Canadian framework. And TAF and so many other groups we're already doing this work. That means we could continue. We could start this work now. I have these visions of a retrofit readiness funnel where we use this opportunity to talk to building owners and operators about this potential, about the benefits that they'll reap from this. And we work now to have them ready so that when these recovery dollars start to flow, we get them back into the marketplace and back into people's hands as fast as possible. Speed is really important for strong recovery, and we have the chance to be ready for it.
Thanks so much, Fatima. I think it's really like fascinating the potential in these multi-unit buildings, like big apartment buildings and condos. Quite often we think of these things in terms of individual houses. People retrofitting their homes, but the scope and scale of what can be accomplished in these multi-unit buildings, I think, is really phenomenal. And what's also really interesting about it too is that people can't really act on their own in these circumstances.
Yeah.
Like if you're in an apartment, you don't own the building, and if you're in a condo, you own the building collectively with a bunch of other people. So you need different mechanisms to fund this. And I think something that needs to be emphasized as well, and you did a good job of doing that here, is that there's a financial payback here. I mean, those kind of changes that you're talking about mean that it's not just a cost. Oh, we're going to upgrade the performance of this building. Isn't it great? It's better quality of life. People have better heating. But maybe you just talk like and emphasize that a little bit, like where the money ultimately comes from, because of course there's always a skepticism. Oh, well, how can government afford to do this? But in this case, this is something that is both climate and quality of life and job generating that actually has a payback. And maybe just dive into that just a second, and then I have some other questions I want to ask you as well.
Sure. Well, definitely, it has a payback, and we have the opportunity of making these truly financially sustainable initiatives despite the significant upfront costs. And one of the things that's increasingly we're seeing evidence of is really great opportunities for private sector dollars and public sector dollars to work together, because there are some measures whose payback is extremely quick. And so for a building owner or operator, thinking about a 10 or 15 year payback period is too long for their economics to work. They've got bills to pay also. But there are ways in which we can complete deep energy retrofits by using public dollars where the payback period takes a little bit longer, or where we're looking more at social outcomes and health outcomes, and then use private sector dollars where the return can be quicker. So that's one example of how sort of flexible these projects can be in terms of financing them. And then another thing I'll point out too is that there are lots of new financial tools available to us on how we finance these projects. The Atmospheric Fund uses a tool called an energy savings performance agreement, where we can proactively look at the estimated payback of the different measures that we're going to implement in a project, and loan that money to the building owner or operator, and then they can pay us back through those realized energy savings. And so this is a way that building owners and operators do not have to incur debt, and because we're working in the interest of the energy efficiency savings, we'll make sure that that's delivered.
Yeah, that's totally a great mechanism to do that. And something else that I've thought about, I've seen discussed as well, is that there are certain pools of money in Canada where the ability to think long term is built into the way that they operate. And you can think of things like pension funds. They have a responsibility to pay out money over long periods of time to people who are collecting pensions. And so their ability to invest in these long-term, long time frame return projects are great as well. We just had a question come in from someone. They're asking, what is a job year? And which was something you talked about. My understanding is that it's a job for a year, but do I have that right?
It's a term that I am also learning about as I dive into this. A job year gives you a sense of how long the job is going to last. So one of the challenges when we think about job creation, we don't know how long that job is going to be there. So if you create a lot of jobs, but they're only 2 or 3 month opportunities, that's not what people need to be able to to thrive in life. So when we talk about job years, we put a time frame on that. So if we use, if something creates 10 job years, that could be 5 jobs for 2 years. And so, a retrofit project could take around 18 to 36 months, depending on the nature of the project and the measures involved. So these are long-term, high-quality jobs that we can create through retrofits.
Great. So what is holding up some of the implementation of this at scale? There's been some great projects done. We dove into the one in particular that you were speaking to as an example. But what has historically held it up? Is it access to capital, or is there other things as well?
We talked a little bit about funding and financing, Tim, but what I would tell you is really important to understand is even when funds are available, building retrofits are tricky. And this is a place that TAF is now doing some new work with many partners to address that complexity. To even start a retrofit project, it takes a ton of I mean, if you think about your own home renovation or home retrofit project, where do I start? How much will it cost? Where will I get the money? Who will I hire? Under what terms? What's in scope? What's out of scope? And the same applies, only harder to a multi-unit residential building. We need to assess the site and set some benchmarks. What is our initial, performance? Permitting, engineering plans. You need to engage tenants and let them know what's happening to their building and educate them, because tenant behavior can impact energy performance. Construction, installation of sometimes equipment that is very innovative and new, and building owners and operators have less of a degree of comfort with it and a lower tolerance of risk. At Arletta, we installed some heat pumps, which were new for the buildings. And so that's a spot where we need an agency to be able to guide building owners and operators through the process. And that's a role that TAF has been playing on the projects that we have been managing for a number of years. But where we see a real market need is for something like what we're calling our Retrofit Delivery Center, to support building owners and operators so that they can complete that work to a high degree of quality and see the outcomes that they want.
Yeah, great, thanks. Somebody's asking us that they've read about building codes being changed to include something called a passive house standard. What is that, and how is that related to deep energy retrofits?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't totally feel equipped to answer it. But the building code is a really important spot for the feds to send a signal right now. When we think about energy efficiency retrofits, we need to start setting some performance benchmarks. I mean, retrofits are taking place, but there's a real pitfall if we start retrofits and building owners and operators or homeowners start investing a little bit of money in doing retrofits, because we can't afford small bits of work at a time. And in fact, that creates further complexity when you try to add or change equipment over time. So a great place for the federal government to work would be in setting performance benchmarks to say, when retrofitting a building, we need to aim for this level of standard, which we know is achievable, so that we start turning over the building stock at the speed and scale we need to.
Yeah, and I think for a passive house too, I mean, that is, building codes being rewritten at a provincial level, which is where they apply the national building code being advisory on the provinces. But, a passive house is one that has very, very low energy needs and produces a lot of its own energy. So it would be essentially energy independent. And that could be a goal for a retrofit, I would imagine, as well. But, that would be probably a lot more challenging. It's much easier to build something from scratch, new, that is either neutral on energy use or slightly positive. I think it's harder with an older building, but as you outlined, there are massive gains to be made, even if we don't achieve the standard of having the building be net energy positive. So let's talk here about what some of the principles of a good recovery plan for Canada would be overall. What are some principles we need to be thinking about, and how do they apply to some of what we've just been talking about in the building sector?
Yeah, I think one really important principle, and we even learned this in the 2009 recovery, is that these stimulus dollars and these recovery dollars need to reach people. That's first and foremost. We've got to get people back to work and ensure that these public dollars support workers and not shareholders. They have to flow into the market and into people's pockets. And these dollars cannot and should not be hoarded by business. Retrofits do really well here. Another principle is that we have to require and support businesses and industry to transition to a low carbon future. Tim, I think you would agree, but it's unthinkable to think that we would flow billions of dollars into yesterday's economy. We can't afford to lock in any more carbon. And again, deep energy retrofits deliver huge nation scale infrastructure projects that address climate needs, will move us on a path to electrification and decarbonization at the scale and pace we need to. And then the third principle I think is really important is speed. And economists will tell you this, but one of the critical elements to a stimulus program is that we can implement it quickly. And when it comes to retrofits, this is an area, like I mentioned, that was already a priority for our federal government. And we have existing programs in place. So these programs can be expanded, they can be made more flexible, so that we're not spending months or years of planning and approvals for new systems, but that we just turn the knobs up on the system we have today.
I think those are all really, really important ones to cover for sure. And I think Laying it out in that way, I think then kind of leads us to the sort of next set of questions. And I think you were going to ask me one.
Yeah, well, I had one for you.
Yeah.
Times are a changing, and Tim, I wondered from your perspective, this isn't just happening in the green movement anymore, or put differently, the green tent is suddenly becoming a lot bigger.
It's a green
Who are
building.
some, the green building now, exactly. Tell me, Tim. So who's surprising you? Who are some sort of new emerging allies in this conversation that we could be reaching out to and engaging?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, Environmental Defense has been working with a number of folks from the labor movement for a number of years. We formed an organization called Blue Green Canada, and we worked on issues like green energy, et cetera, over the past 10 years. But the opportunities to work together continue to grow. And this conversation about green recovery, green economic transition has only increased in intensity and urgency. And I think the reason for that is very much inside of what we were just talking about specific to buildings, which is that there is so much work available to actually build the future society that we want. A lot of those jobs are highly skilled, they're diverse. Many of them are unionized, which is really important in terms of ensuring that people are being paid well and that they have benefits and that their other needs in the workforce are being addressed. So I think there's a huge interest there from labor. As you mentioned as well, we have a lot of interest from capital. Increasingly, people with money and places looking for it to invest are looking into the clean energy and clean tech sector because there's just opportunities to make money there in a way that there didn't used to be. And institutional investors are arriving probably earlier than others. And I think that is really because of their ability to think longer term. And of course, when we're talking about addressing climate change and biodiversity loss and impacts to the planet, inherently we need to be thinking long term, and we need to be matching the portions, at least, of our economic system that can think long term with these long term investments. So there are a bunch of new allies that are emerging. I was reading a question. We got someone from the audience here. And what do we have here? What is the relationship between renewables and retrofits? Well, there can be a direct relationship between them or an indirect one. So the direct relationship, of course, is that you can actually have renewables as part of a building retrofit. So you could put solar thermal or solar electricity on a building. You could put huge solar panels on the roof, a huge array of solar panels on the roof of a new building or a retrofitted building to produce electricity. You could also do solar hot water or solar air thermal. So that can be a direct link. There's also, of course, the fact that as we transition our electricity system, moving it more and more to one that is using electricity for cooling and heating instead of gas means that we can get off fossil fuels. And to do that, we need electricity, and that electricity needs to come from the grid, from sources that are not burning fossil fuels. In Ontario, of course, where our offices are located, the electricity grid is quite clean. There's not a lot of fossil fuels, but we still burn considerable amount of natural gas. In some provinces, of course, an awful lot of the electricity produced is still coming from coal and natural gas. And so moving that towards wind, solar, geothermal, et cetera, is very important for ensuring that our sources of heating as we do these retrofits is coming from a clean source. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to ask Fatima one more question before we really just dive into a series of Q&As from our audience. And Fatima, what is it that is keeping you motivated and hopeful right now? We've got this current crisis, of course, but we also have the long-term climate crisis. And how do you bring these kind of concerns of being trapped in their house and thinking about the future, and what makes you hopeful?
I've been asked this a couple of times before the pandemic, even when you think about the climate crisis. And one of the things for sure, Tim, I've been working in this space for 15 years, and it's never been like this before. There have never been more people signing on to webinars like today's to have these conversations. I mean it when I say that. Suddenly there are so many places that these conversations are taking place, and people want to understand what's going on and what they can do and where their power lies and what we need to change. And I get a tremendous amount of motivation from that. And I think right now, Tim, I've got to say, like, seeing the way our public servants and our leaders are stepping up, and government is leading the way and able to look at this crisis in the face and say we can and we'll figure out how to get through this together. That makes me feel pretty buoyant.
That's great. Yeah, I think whenever there's a situation like this, it's difficult sometimes to see the end of it. But I do think so much of the work that's been done to date has created an incredible platform for moving forward. So right now, I just really want to use the last 15 minutes or so that we have left to look at some of the questions we've received from our audience and try and answer some of them. Or if I can't, then perhaps we'll be able to have Fatima do that. Just waiting for a couple to come up here. Here's a question. We have proven that we can act collectively to act in unison to address critical healthcare issues. So how can we apply this learning to our environmental issues? That's a really good question, I think. There's been a lot of skepticism about government and the ability of government to be effective in our society, and more sense that large corporations and global trade and everything else are the decision makers, and government increasingly is a spectator and an ineffective one at that. But I think that this crisis really underscores the ability of governments to act, and in fact that only governments can act in a situation where there is a crisis. I also think that it underscores the need for our society to pay attention to science and what scientists are telling us and how to address critical issues. So evidence and data and science matter. And that data, evidence, and science being used by governments that actually do have power to act should tell us a lot about how we want to move forward to address the climate and biodiversity crisis, because they're very similar. Just because they're more slowly moving than a contagious virus doesn't mean that the consequences of not addressing them in a uniform, organized, science-based way will not lead us to the same kind of crisis. So there's strong parallels. And as we emerge from this, we need to be focusing our recovery efforts in a way that takes heed of both of those key points, and that has an incredibly important role for governments to coordinate response to this crisis in a way that doesn't stumble us towards the next one. Stephen, you want to add anything to that?
Just as you were talking, Tim, I was thinking about the level of coordination and communication between the federal government and the provinces and the cities and our local governments. And I think that I'm really hopeful that working on this crisis together has built up a level of trust between these parties, because we need our governments to be working together and to be able to, as you said, follow the science and the evidence and the data and make good decisions in the public's interest, and still be able, irrespective of our political lines and our political ideologies. And so I hope that we're, when I hear that our Deputy Prime Minister and our Premier are becoming fast friends, I hope that will help us when we start addressing environmental issues next.
Yeah, if conservatives and liberals can be fast friends, then we can solve any problem.
Anything.
Here's another question. How can we best use resources to develop greener energy instead of just bailing out fossil fuel companies? I'm thinking of the work that needs to be done to bridge between the two. Are there projects already in place? It's an interesting question, because there's a lot of conversation in the media about large fossil fuel companies, changing to being energy companies. that they are investing in, say, solar and wind, etc. Unfortunately, that's really not happening at scale. In fact, at a global level, last year, less than 1% of the capital expenditures by fossil fuel companies were in the renewable energy space. Now, that doesn't mean that massive amounts of capital are not being increasingly attracted to wind and solar, because they are, and that's because, largely because of effectiveness and competitiveness. The price of solar, the returns from solar and wind farms, if you're an investor, have gone way up. But what we're seeing is that, in fact, it's money from other sources that is investing in these projects. It's not coming from the fossil fuel industry. And there's a bunch of reasons for that we will explore more in our upcoming discussion around climate and energy in coming weeks. But we're not really seeing that. But we do have a lot of capital moving into the space, but just not. So I think that's all the questions that we have coming from our audience. But I really want to thank all of you for joining us today and for all the thoughtful questions that you sent to us. In the coming weeks, we're going to dig into several of the solution areas that I just mentioned at the top. So I'll just go over some, again, just give you some teaser examples of things we're going to be addressing, looking at issues like employing oil workers in geothermal electricity. Alberta and BC have huge potential for that, and of course, a workforce that could be employed there. Looking at Canadian electric buses and cars, I bet a lot of people didn't know that we're already a leader in the public transportation side of electrification. Looking at chemistry and materials, learn from nature and how we can employ that, and looking at money and jobs from plastic waste, something that we've dived into quite heavily at Environmental Defense. So all of these topics will be explored, and we'll be back next week with the first one. We'll be discussing climate change in Canada. As many of you have seen in the news, and we talked about her earlier briefly in this webinar, the oil and gas industry, both in Canada and internationally, has been using this crisis to look for more subsidies and regulatory rollbacks. So we'll dive into that, look who's behind it, and look at some of the alternative policies in the energy sector that can be able to build a resilient, low carbon society across Canada and around the world. So if you're looking for more info in the meantime, please keep in touch with us at Environmental Defense. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and you can also reach out to us by email. We're always happy to chat and have our staff connect with you. And thank you very much for joining us, and check out the version of this on YouTube if you'd like, and please share it with your friends. Thank you so much, and see you next week.